Chapter 1. The guests assemble. The heavy stone walls of Greystone Manor stood solemn against the fading afternoon light, its gables and chimneys cut into sharp silhouettes by the lowering sun. The house had belonged to Sir Charles Ashbury's family for nearly 2 centuries, though in recent years its grandeur had come to seem a little weathered, the lawns less precisely kept, and the staff reduced to a skeleton crew. Still, when the lamps were lit and the long dining table set for 10, the manor retained its imposing air of English dignity. Captain Arthur Hastings, recently returned from the continent, found himself once more invited to the sort of country gathering he secretly enjoyed. It was Sir Charles himself who had extended the invitation, an old acquaintance from the regiment, and Hastings, ever sociable, had accepted with pleasure. He arrived that afternoon, his valise deposited by a footman whose shoes had lost their polish, and was shown into a drawing-room where a fire already burned. Several guests were gathered, all seated in attitudes of polite expectancy. Lady Ashbury, a handsome woman in her late 40s, rose to greet him with a gracious smile. "My dear Captain Hastings, how kind of you to come. Sir Charles was most insistent that you should join our little party. We have been quite in need of some new company." Hastings bowed and offered some courteous remark before being introduced around. There was Colonel Gerald Whitcomb, a florid man of 60 with a booming laugh that carried across the room whether invited or not. Near him sat Miss Violet Linton, a governess by occupation, though here as the guest of Lady Ashbury. She had fine eyes, though they seemed to watch the others rather than join in their talk. On the settee opposite, Mrs. Arabella Miles adjusted her bracelets with nervous fingers. Recently widowed, her voice when she spoke had the flutter of a bird startled from its nest. Close beside her, perhaps a little too close, lounged Mr. Edward Miles, her late husband's nephew, who carried himself with an air of easy insolence. At the far end of the room, leafing through a book he appeared not to read, sat Dr. Leonard Trent, the village physician, a man with a brow too furrowed for his 40 years. He looked up only to nod curtly when Hastings was presented to him. Conversation was stiff at first, as though each guest were listening for some undercurrent beneath the surface of civility. Sir Charles entered presently, a tall man with a thick mane of white hair carrying his walking stick, though he scarcely seemed to need it. His laugh rang out, and for a while it appeared the company warmed under his jovial authority. They moved into dinner, where the meal was served with formality. Clear soup, a roast pheasant, and a rich pudding. Though Hastings noticed the dishes were not as lavish as once might have been expected in such a house. Lady Ashbury directed the conversation, but there were odd lapses. Mrs. Miles, for instance, seemed on the verge of saying something more than once, only to sip her wine in silence. Dr. Trent scarcely spoke at all, and Edward Miles laughed rather loudly at his own jokes, a habit that earned a rebuke in Lady Ashbury's steady gaze. It was not until coffee was taken in the library that the final guest arrived. The butler announced him with a slight clearing of the throat. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot." Hastings started visibly. "Poirot, my dear fellow." The little Belgian detective advanced with impeccable neatness, his moustaches waxed to perfection, his patent leather shoes shining despite the damp roads outside. His egg-shaped head inclined with courtesy to the company, as he took Lady Ashbury's hand and bowed. "I trust you forgive my lateness," Poirot said. "The trains, they are never exact, and I am most exact. You see how it is." A difficulty. Sir Charles laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "We are delighted you could join us, Monsieur Poirot. You will lend quite the cosmopolitan air to our gathering." As the evening wore on, Hastings found himself watching Poirot with interest. The detective sat, hands delicately steepled as the others spoke, interjecting little but listening with evident attention. When Colonel Whitcomb launched into a long tale of India, Poirot inclined his head politely, but did not press for details. When Edward Miles made some cutting remark about fortunes lost in poor investments, Poirot's eyes flickered for the briefest instant toward Lady Ashbury, and Hastings wondered what he had seen. At length, the ladies retired and the gentlemen followed. The night was cool, with a rising mist curling across the lawns. Hastings paused at the top of the grand staircase, listening to the hush that settled over the manor once the servants had extinguished the last lamps. It was only then that Poirot drew near, his voice pitched low. "My friend Hastings, how good it is to see you again." And are you Poirot? But what brings you to Greystone? Surely not the pheasant alone. Poirot's lips curved in a small enigmatic smile. Ah, that I cannot say. Not yet. But one thing, mon ami, is clear to me already. These good people, each has their secret. It is the nature of a house such as this. And where there are secrets, Hastings, he tapped a finger to his temple, there is often tragedy. Hastings shivered slightly, though the fire still glowed below. The first night at Greystone Manor closed in silence, but it was a silence that carried with it a curious weight, as though the house itself listened. Outside, the mist thickened, blurring the moon, while within, behind bedroom doors and bolted shutters, each guest of Sir Charles Ashbury lay wakeful, turning over in mind those matters which must never under any circumstance come to light. Chapter 2. The Death in the Study. The following morning broke with a thin veil of fog lying low upon the lawns, giving Greystone Manor an air of ghostly isolation. The house stirred slowly to life. From his room, Hastings heard the faint clang of the servant's bell, the muffled footsteps in corridors, and somewhere far below the rattle of pans in the kitchen. He dressed with military precision, recalling with some amusement Poirot's fastidious ways, and ascended to the breakfast-room. There he found Lady Ashbury presiding with calm authority, a silver coffee-pot at her elbow. Colonel Whitcomb was already tucking into bacon and eggs with gusto, while Miss Linton nibbled on toast, her eyes shadowed as though she had not slept well. Poirot entered last, immaculate as ever in his grey suit, moustaches glistening, shoes spotless. He bowed to Lady Ashbury and seated himself with a word of apology. His plate, Hastings noticed, remained largely untouched, as he contented himself with coffee and a croissant. Sir Charles did not appear. His absence at first drew little remark. Lady Ashbury, however, glanced more than once towards the door with a faint tightening of her lips. It was nearly 9:30 when a footman entered, pale-faced, and leaned towards her. The silver pot trembled as she set it down too quickly. "Sir Charles is not in his chamber, my lady," the man stammered. "His bed is unslept in." A curious silence fell. Colonel Whitcomb cleared his throat noisily. Edward Miles gave a sharp laugh that jarred the nerves, and Mrs. Miles set down her teacup with a clatter. Poirot rose quietly. "Permit me, Lady Ashbury. We will seek him together, yes?" Lady Ashbury's composure held by a thread. She inclined her head and led the way down the long passage towards Sir Charles's study. Hastings, unable to resist, followed in their wake, along with several of the other guests who had risen with sudden, uneasy curiosity. The heavy oak door stood closed. Lady Ashbury knocked once. Receiving no reply, she pressed down the handle. The door yielded with a slow groan. The curtains were half drawn, and the air smelled faintly of stale smoke. On the wide carpet before the desk, Sir Charles Ashbury lay sprawled. His face was unnaturally pale, the eyes half open, staring at the ceiling. One hand clutched his walking stick, the other was flung wide, palm upward, fingers curled as if in protest. A sharp cry broke from Lady Ashbury, but Poirot's hand was instantly at her elbow, steadying her. "Courage, madame." "Do not look," Dr. Trent pushed forward, fell to his knees, and after a moment's examination pronounced in a strained voice, "He is dead. Quite dead, I should say." For several hours the silence deepened. It seemed to Hastings that the house itself had stopped breathing. Poirot, meanwhile, had stepped delicately into the room. He knelt, not touching, but gazing with extraordinary concentration. His eyes moved from the position of the body to the desk, then to the hearth, where a few ashes smouldered faintly. He sniffed once at the air, his nostrils flaring. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured. "The smallest detail. It is always of importance. Regard, for example, the diary upon the desk." Hastings looked. There, beside an overturned inkwell, lay a stout leather-bound book. Its pages were open, but the edges had been hastily scorched, as though thrown into the fire and rescued only half in time. Across the visible page words had been written in Sir Charles's firm hand, now smudged and blotched with ink. Poirot bent low, reading silently. Hastings strained, but could catch only a single phrase. "The truth must come out, though it may destroy us all." The colonel let out a harumph of impatience. "Suicide, I dare say." The man was troubled. Everyone knows that. "Some business about money." Poirot's eyes flickered. "Suicide, mon colonel? And yet, where is the weapon? You perceive none? The colonel flushed, muttering. Indeed, there was no revolver, no vial of poison, only the lifeless body and the ominous diary. Poirot turned to Dr. Trent. You will make the examination, Doctor. Meanwhile, it is necessary that no one leaves this house. Lady Ashbury, I implore you, have the servants remain within, for until we know more we must treat this, he paused delicately, as murder. A gasp rose from Mrs. Miles. Edward Miles's laugh rang out again, but brittle now. Miss Linton sat very still, her eyes fixed upon Poirot with an intensity that struck Hastings as strange. Poirot closed the diary gently, his fingertips precise, almost reverent. A man does not write thus if he contemplates his own destruction, he said softly. None, Hastings. Sir Charles Ashbury has been silenced. The words seemed to hang in the air long after he spoke them, and in that moment Hastings knew, though he could not have said why, that nothing at Greystone Manor would ever be the same again. Chapter 3. Poirot takes command. The corridors of Greystone Manor echoed with hurried steps and whispered voices. Servants clustered uneasily in the hallways, while the guests, pale and unsettled, drifted toward the library where Poirot had requested they assemble. It was as though the entire house had been drawn into a net, and at the centre stood the small, fastidious figure of Hercule Poirot. Hastings watched his friend with familiar admiration. Where others flustered or argued, Poirot remained perfectly composed. His hands, delicate and precise, smoothed the lapel of his coat as he took his place before the hearth. The flames cast a warm glow upon his immaculate attire, but his eyes were cold, sharp, and measuring. Messieurs, mesdames, he began, bowing slightly, permit me. I shall speak plainly. Sir Charles Ashbury is dead. The circumstances, how do you say, compel me to believe it is not the natural end of a man who lies down to sleep and does not wake. Non, here we have something darker. A murmur rose among the group. Colonel Whitcomb muttered, about damned nonsense, while Mrs. Miles pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips. Lady Ashbury sat very straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale but resolute. Poirot raised a hand for silence. You will ask, why do I intrude? Because it is my misfortune, or perhaps my destiny, that where crime walks, Hercule Poirot is not far behind. It was by invitation of your husband, Lady Ashbury, that I came. He wrote to me, most urgently, and now he is dead. His letter spoke of grave anxieties, though he did not confide all. For that, he promised, I must read his diary. He glanced towards the small table where the scorched volume lay, guarded now by Hastings. A heavy weight seemed to rest upon the room as he spoke the word diary. Miss Violet Linton leaned forward, her eyes bright. Then you think, someone here? She faltered, unable to finish the thought. Poirot inclined his head gravely. It is possible, mademoiselle. Indeed, it is probable. The house was locked. The night was quiet. No stranger entered. We have, as you English say, a closed circle. Hastings could not help but note the shift in the atmosphere. Faces stiffened, eyes darted sidelong, a subtle tightening of shoulders as if each guest suddenly felt the invisible chains of suspicion settle around them. Dr. Trent spoke at last, his tone dry. If you wish it so, Poirot, I shall perform a thorough examination. But I tell you now, I found no mark of violence. The heart may have failed him, peut-être, Poirot replied softly. And yet, I think not. You see the diary, it tells me otherwise. And also, he lifted a delicate finger, the ashes in the grate, the ink spilled upon the desk, the curious absence of certain objects one might expect to find. They are small things, yes, but to Poirot they speak. Colonel Whitcomb exploded in impatience. Confound it all, man! Must we sit here and be treated like criminals? I have no more to do with Ashbury's death than the cat in the stables. Poirot's gaze rested on him calmly. Perhaps, mon colonel. Yet you will forgive me if I require your account of last night with precision, and the same for all of you. So the questioning began. Poirot, with his courteous bows and soft voice, moved from one to another, drawing out details with maddening exactitude. Lady Ashbury said she retired at 10:30, though she admitted she did not sleep until late. She had heard Sir Charles go down the corridor toward his study shortly before midnight. He was restless these last weeks, she confessed. Business troubles weighed upon him. Colonel Whitcomb declared he had played a game of cards with Edward Miles until nearly 11, then smoked a cigar in the billiard room. He swore he never saw Sir Charles after dinner. Edward Miles, lounging insolently in his chair, confirmed the card game but added with a smirk that the Colonel had drunk more brandy than was wise. He himself had gone to bed around midnight, give or take. Mrs. Miles fluttered and fidgeted, claiming she had been indisposed and went early to her chamber. I took a draught the doctor prescribed, and I slept heavily. I heard nothing at all, she insisted. Miss Linton, quiet but steady, said she had sat up reading until 1 o'clock. I sleep poorly in new houses, she added. She thought she heard footsteps in the corridor, but could not be sure whose. And Dr. Trent himself? He maintained that he retired before 11, exhausted from a day of patients in the village. I am not a young man, Poirot, he said tersely. I do not linger over brandy and cigars. Poirot listened, nodding, never interrupting, only occasionally tilting his head as though to catch some faint discord in their words. When all had spoken, he stood very still for a moment, eyes half closed. Bon, we shall see. But I tell you this, the truth. It leaves traces, and already I perceive them. The company shifted uneasily. Somewhere in the silence that followed, the great clock in the hall struck 11, its chimes echoing through the manor. Poirot straightened his cuffs. Until the doctor's examination is complete, we shall proceed no further. But remember, mes amis, whoever killed Sir Charles Ashbury believed they could conceal their act. To Poirot, such belief is folly. Hastings caught a glimpse of Lady Ashbury's face as Poirot spoke. Her lips trembled ever so slightly, and her gaze drifted not to her husband's diary, but to the fire where the last grey ashes of some half-burnt pages still lingered. Chapter 4. The First Threads. The morning lengthened into a grey, oppressive noon. Clouds rolled across the sky, casting the lawns in shadow. Greystone Manor, with its stone facade and shuttered windows, seemed to retreat within itself, as though the house resented scrutiny. Within, however, Hercule Poirot was very much awake, his little grey cells alive to every nuance, every word, every hesitation that might betray the truth. Dr. Trent had completed his examination, and now reported gravely in the study. The guests assembled once more, some pale with fear, others defiant in manner. Hastings stood near Poirot, notebook in hand, though he knew well that his friend's extraordinary memory required no assistance. "The cause of death," said the doctor, "is obscure. There are no wounds, no bruises, no sign of poison that I could detect without laboratory tests. The heart may have failed. Yet the man was not known to suffer heart complaints. He was strong for his age." Poirot lifted his brows. "Precisely, doctor. A heart so robust does not cease to beat without persuasion." "Still," Trent persisted, "I cannot point to any definite instrument of persuasion. If poison was used, it was subtle indeed." "Subtle," murmured Poirot, "is the word." Colonel Whitcomb grunted. "All this mystery, when the plain fact is, Ashbury had debts. A man in his position, pressed by creditors, could have taken his own life rather than face disgrace." "Eh bien, mon colonel," Poirot said softly, "and yet, the revolver, it is not found. The poison, it is not present. And the diary, half burnt, it does not read as the farewell of a man who resigns himself. Non, it is a record of fear, of something he expected from another." Lady Ashbury stirred, her eyes fixed on Poirot. "You have read the diary, Monsieur Poirot?" "Only a fragment," he replied. "What was saved from the flames?" But it was enough to tell me this. Sir Charles had uncovered some truth, something dangerous enough that he sought my counsel. He believed someone here, his hand swept delicately to include them all, was hiding it. Mrs. Miles gave a faint sob and clasped her handkerchief. Edward Miles, however, leaned forward, a spark of challenge in his eyes. "If you mean to accuse us, Poirot, you had best be sure. Sir Charles had enemies enough in London in his business dealings. You cannot possibly think the answer lies here alone." Poirot's gaze rested on him, steady, unreadable. "You are clever, monsieur. But consider, the house was closed, the servants accounted for. No stranger entered last night. If Sir Charles's enemy struck, it was from within." The words fell like stones into still water. Hastings felt the tension ripple through the room. He saw Miss Linton's hand tighten on the arm of her chair, the Colonel shift heavily, Lady Ashbury close her eyes a brief instant as though bracing herself. Poirot moved then with his usual briskness. Now, let us examine the movements of last night more closely. Already I see small inconsistencies. Let us take, for example, the matter of time. He turned to Miss Linton. You say you read until 1 o'clock, mademoiselle. Tell me, what book engaged your attention so late? A volume of Shakespeare, Monsieur Poirot, The Tempest. Très bien. And you heard footsteps, yes? At what hour? She hesitated. It must have been some minutes after 12. Poirot nodded, then faced Edward Miles. Monsieur, you claim to retire around midnight, give or take. Would you be so good as to be precise? Did you pass down the corridor near Sir Charles's study? Edward smirked. I may have, yes. But if Miss Linton heard footsteps, they could have been mine. I went to my chamber directly. Aha, murmured Poirot. So we have two accounts that intersect. And you, Colonel? You played cards until? Until 11, as I said, Whitcomb barked. After that, the billiard room, a cigar, then bed. I've nothing to add. Poirot's gaze softened but did not release him. And the brandy? You drank alone? The Colonel's flush betrayed annoyance. I poured 1 glass only. You make too much of trifles. On the contrary, Poirot said gently, trifles make the sum. He moved on. Madame, Miles, you say you slept heavily. Yet Dr. Trent's draught, does it not cause vivid dreams, or perhaps restlessness? Her fingers trembled as she pressed the handkerchief tighter. I do not remember dreams, only darkness. Poirot inclined his head. It is of no consequence, for now. He paused, letting the silence grow heavy. Then he turned to Lady Ashbury. One question more, madame. You heard your husband leave his chamber at midnight. Did he say anything to you? Her eyes flickered, but her voice was steady. No, he went quietly. I thought he sought solitude. Merci. Poirot's bow was courteous, but Hastings felt the charge in the air. At last Poirot straightened. We advance. Already I discern that one among you is not frank. It is always so. The lie, it creeps in, small, almost invisible. Yet Poirot, he sees it. And soon, mes amis, we shall have the whole truth. He gathered his hands, fingertips pressed together. For the moment, you will forgive me. I must inspect the study once more, with Hastings. There are details to be considered. Ashes, ink, the position of a walking stick. They are like notes in a symphony. When assembled, they play the melody of murder. Without waiting for reply, he turned, his small feet tapping briskly across the floor. Hastings, casting a last look at the uneasy company, followed close behind. In the study, the air still held that faint, acrid tang. Poirot bent over the desk, examining the charred fragments of the diary. Carefully he picked one up with the tips of his fingers. See here, Hastings. The ink smear, too fresh for midnight. It was written nearer to his death. And these ashes, look how unevenly they are burnt. Someone tried to destroy them in haste, then thought better. Hastings frowned. But who? And why save part when all could have been burned? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, mon ami, that is the question. And I think, perhaps it was not the murderer who rescued these pages. Perhaps another, someone who feared the truth, yet could not bear to see it vanish entirely. He placed the fragment down, his expression unreadable. Then, very softly, he added, There is more in this house than murder, Hastings. There is guilt of many kinds, and before long it will all come to light. Chapter 5. Shadows of Suspicion. By late afternoon, the household had fallen into a strange rhythm of unease. Servants crept about their duties with lowered eyes, the guests kept to the drawing-room or library in tense groups, and outside the windows the mist rolled in heavy banks across the gardens, as though sealing Greystone Manor off from the world. Hastings sat with Poirot in the small morning-room overlooking the east lawn. Poirot had insisted upon this vantage point, declaring that the sun, when it deigns to appear, brings clarity. Yet the grey skies afforded little light, and Hastings found the room cold despite the fire. Poirot, however, appeared unaffected, his gaze intent upon a small sheaf of notes he had made. Mon ami, he said at last, you have heard their stories, n'est-ce pas? And already you form conclusions. Well, yes, Hastings admitted. It seems to me Edward Miles is the most likely. He inherits something, doesn't he? His manner is impudent enough, and he admitted himself to be in the corridor around midnight. Poirot's moustaches twitched. So, you choose the obvious. And yet, have you observed how quickly he offers himself as a suspect? That, Hastings, is most curious. Hastings blinked. But why would he do such a thing? Poirot leaned back, fingertips pressed together. Perhaps because he knows that to appear careless is to seem innocent. Or perhaps because he is indeed innocent and too foolish to perceive the danger. Both are possible. Before Hastings could reply, the door opened and Lady Ashbury entered. Her composure was as carefully arranged as her dark gown, yet the tightness about her mouth betrayed strain. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "may I speak with you privately?" "Mais certainement." Poirot rose with a bow, ushering her to a chair. Hastings made to leave, but Poirot gestured him back. "No, Hastings, you will remain." "My friend is discreet." Lady Ashbury hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair. "Monsieur Poirot, I must beg of you, spare me unnecessary humiliation, if my husband has left some record in his diary. I fear it may concern matters best forgotten. Business indiscretions, debts." Perhaps more Poirot regarded her steadily. "Madam, your fear is natural. But I think what your husband wrote was not of business alone. It was personal, and he feared not scandal only, but danger." Her hands twisted in her lap. "Then you believe, truly, that he was murdered?" Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, murdered, and by one who knew him well." Her face hardened suddenly. "Then I beg you, do not drag my family name into disgrace. Discover the truth, but quietly, I implore you." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Discretion is always my aim. Yet the truth, it must be known. Otherwise, madam, there can be no peace." Lady Ashbury rose swiftly, her composure restored as though by force. She gave a curt nod and departed without another word. Hastings exhaled. "She's hiding something, Poirot. I'll swear to it." "Ah, mon ami," Poirot murmured. "You have the eye of suspicion, but not the balance. Yes, she hides something. But is it guilt of crime or of shame? We must not confuse the two." Later that day, Poirot convened the household again in the library. The great room seemed darker than ever, the heavy shelves of books pressing down like watchful eyes. The guests assembled reluctantly, their faces strained. "My friends," Poirot began, "it is necessary I ask more questions. Forgive me if they cause discomfort. Murder, it does not respect politeness. He turned to Dr. Trent first. Doctor, you prescribed to Madame Miles a draught, yes?" "A sedative?" "Yes," Trent said shortly. "She suffers nerves." "A mild tincture." "Quite safe," Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Safe, unless perhaps increased." The doctor stiffened. "In excess it might be dangerous, but I assure you I gave her only the recommended dose." Mrs. Miles gave a small cry. "I never touched more than he prescribed." "I swear it." Poirot inclined his head and moved on. "Colonel Whitcomb, you said you played cards until 11. Who dealt the last hand?" The colonel frowned. "Why, Miles did, I think," Edward smirked. "I did, yes. And I won." "Just so," Poirot said mildly. "And afterward you smoked alone. Was the door of the billiard room closed?" "Of course." To keep out the draught, Poirot's eyes glimmered. "Then tell me, Colonel, how did you hear the clock strike 12? Whitcomb's mouth opened, then closed again. Why? "I did not say I heard it." "No," Poirot replied softly. "But it is in your manner, monsieur. You place yourself at bed by 11:30. Yet I think you sat longer, perhaps until midnight. And perhaps you heard something else as well, voices, footsteps. No?" The colonel flushed, but said nothing. Poirot turned next to Miss Linton. "Mademoiselle, your room is near the study, is it not? You read Shakespeare until 1. Did you hear a door close? Or voices?" Miss Linton hesitated, colour rising in her cheeks. Yes, I heard Sir Charles speaking to a man. I could not distinguish the words, but the voice was low and angry. A murmur passed through the room. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And this was near midnight?" "Yes," she whispered. "Merci, mademoiselle. That is of great importance." The eyes of the company shifted, suspicious, calculating. Poirot stood silent for a long moment, then said, "We advance, mes amis. One of you spoke with Sir Charles that night. Angry words were exchanged. and soon after he was dead. Mrs. Miles cried out, "Who was it? Who?" Poirot raised a hand. "Patience! The truth comes step by step. Already the mask of lies begins to slip. Soon we shall see the face beneath the fire cracked loudly in the silence that followed, and it seemed to Hastings that every soul in that library shrank a little closer into the shadows. Chapter 6. The Smouldering Clue. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke that night. Rain lashed against the windows and the wind rattled the shutters of Greystone Manor, as though impatient to enter. The house, already heavy with suspicion, seemed to groan under the assault of the weather. Hastings could not sleep. The thought of Sir Charles's lifeless form on the study carpet haunted him. At last, restless, he took up a candle and stepped softly into the corridor. To his surprise, he found Poirot already abroad, a small lamp in hand, his dressing gown immaculate, and slippers polished as though for inspection. "Ah, Hastings," Poirot whispered, raising a finger for silence. "It is as I thought. You too cannot sleep. Bon, come with me. There is something I must see once more." They descended the stairs, shadows leaping across the walls as the lamps flickered. The study door creaked as Poirot pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of smoke still, though the body had been removed. The desk, however, remained just as before, save for the diary locked now in Poirot's care. Poirot moved to the hearth and knelt. With delicate fingers he sifted the grey ash. Suddenly his hand paused. From the debris he extracted a tiny scrap of paper, charred at the edges, but with words still legible in bold black ink. He handed it silently to Hastings. It read, "Trust no one, not even." The remainder was lost to fire. Hastings frowned. "Good heavens, Poirot. That looks like a warning." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Just so, mon ami, and observe, the paper is torn, not simply burnt. Someone tore out this page before attempting the destruction." He stood, dusting his hands carefully. "But who? And why? That is what we must discover." As they examined the desk once more, Poirot's gaze alighted on the walking stick that still leaned against the chair. He picked it up delicately. "You see, Hastings? At first, I thought this the mere habit of an old man. But Sir Charles was not infirm. He carried it always, yes, but as a symbol, a vanity, not a need." He tapped the stick lightly against the desk. The hollow sound rang oddly. Poirot's brows shot upward. With swift fingers he twisted the handle. It came away, revealing a hidden cavity. Within, snug and glittering in the lamplight, lay a small vial. Hastings gasped. "Poison?" "Without doubt," Poirot said softly. "It is the neatness that convinces me." To conceal within the stick, it is ingenious. A touch upon a glass, a drop in a drink. Ah, and yet the vial is still here. That, Hastings, is most strange. He replaced the stick with care. The murderer. He used another method, or else was disturbed. Either way, this discovery tells us much. They left the study, but as they stepped into the corridor, Hastings stiffened. A shadow moved at the far end, someone retreating swiftly into the darkness. Poirot's lamp caught only the swish of a garment before it vanished. "Who was it?" Hastings whispered. Poirot shook his head slowly. "I could not say. But whoever spies upon us at this hour, they have something to hide." The following morning the storm had passed, leaving the gardens drenched and sparkling with reluctant sunlight. Poirot, however, wasted no time. At breakfast he addressed the company gravely. "Mes amis, last night I made a discovery. The walking stick of Sir Charles contained a secret, a vial, hidden most cunningly. It contained poison." A collective gasp rose. Mrs. Miles dropped her spoon with a clatter. The Colonel swore under his breath. Edward Miles gave a low whistle. Poirot raised a hand. "But do not fear. The vial is intact. No drop has been used. It is merely evidence that Sir Charles suspected danger and prepared himself to conceal something of value, or of peril." Lady Ashbury's face was white. "Do you mean he knew someone intended to kill him?" "Oui, madame. He knew. The diary, the vial, the attempt to burn his words, all tell the same story." Poirot's eyes swept the room. "And last night someone watched me in the study. Who among you walks the corridors at such an hour?" No one answered. Miss Linton shifted uneasily but said nothing. The Colonel stared stonily ahead. Dr. Trent's face was a mask of cold control. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch before speaking again. So, it is as I thought. The murderer grows uneasy. That is well. Soon, the pressure, it will break them. Later, alone with Hastings, Poirot paced the morning room, his hands fluttering like quick birds. We come nearer, mon ami. The torn page, the hidden vial, the midnight eavesdropper. They are pieces of the puzzle. One more, perhaps, and the whole picture will reveal itself. But mark me. His eyes shone suddenly. The key is psychology. Always psychology. One among them fears not discovery of the act itself, but of the motive behind it, and that, Hastings, will be their undoing. Chapter 7. Secrets in the Rain. The rain had left the gardens sodden and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. By afternoon, low clouds pressed close to the windows of Greystone Manor, turning the great rooms dim and oppressive. Hastings sat uneasily by the library fire, watching Poirot pace with his measured steps, his small, neat shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. "Poirot," Hastings ventured at last, "you've hinted often enough that the murderer will betray themselves by psychology. But I confess I see nothing unusual. They are all nervous, yes, but naturally so, under suspicion." Poirot's moustaches quivered. "Ah, Hastings, you look, but you do not observe." "There is a difference. Nervousness, yes, is to be expected. But there are kinds of nervousness. The guilty, they fear exposure. The innocent, they fear suspicion. One lies to protect the self, the other lies for another reason entirely." Before Hastings could question further, the door opened and Miss Violet Linton entered. She looked pale, her dark eyes restless. Poirot bowed and gestured her to a chair. "Mademoiselle, you will permit me," he said softly, "to trouble you with questions." She hesitated. "If I can help, Monsieur Poirot. You told us you heard Sir Charles speaking to a man. Angry words, low voices. Think carefully, mademoiselle. Was the voice familiar?" Miss Linton's fingers twisted in her lap. I could not be certain, but—" she faltered. "But—" Poirot leaned forward, his eyes keen. "It reminded me," she whispered, "of Mr. Edward Miles." A sharp intake of breath came from Hastings. "Poirot." "Then it was Miles." Poirot did not move. "Reminded you?" "That is not certainty." Mademoiselle Miss Linton flushed. "No, I cannot swear to it, but I believe it was a." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Merci, your honesty is noted." When she had left, Hastings exclaimed, "That settles it, Poirot. Edward Miles quarrelled with Sir Charles. He had the strongest motive, and he admits to being near the study." Poirot's lips curved in a faint smile. "So simple, eh, Hastings?" "Too simple. I tell you, if Edward Miles is guilty, he plays the role of the fool too well, and if he is innocent, his enemies will gladly let suspicion rest upon him. Either way, we must not leap." Later that day, Poirot sought out Mrs. Arabella Miles. She was in the drawing-room, staring out at the dripping garden with eyes wide and anxious. She started when Poirot spoke her name. "Madame, forgive me. But I must know, your husband, he died but months ago, did he not?" Her lips trembled. "Yes, it was sudden. An illness of the heart," they said. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "They said? You do not believe?" She pressed the handkerchief to her lips. "I hardly know what to believe. There was so much talk, debts, quarrels, and Charles, Sir Charles. He knew things." "Things, madame?" She shook her head. "I cannot say. Only that he warned me once. Arabella, beware what you trust. Not all kin are kind." Poirot studied her closely, but she seemed genuinely distressed, her hands trembling as she spoke. That evening, as the company gathered again for supper, Poirot observed them all with the detachment of a chess player over his board. The Colonel barked out comments with forced joviality. Edward Miles lounged insolently, but his eyes darted too quickly. Lady Ashbury remained regal but brittle, Miss Linton silent and withdrawn, and Dr. Trent, always watchful, always guarded. It was midway through the meal that a small drama occurred. A servant entered with a tray of decanters, and Edward Miles, helping himself freely, remarked with a sneer, "If Sir Charles were here, he'd tell us all to beware the brandy. He never drank it, said he trusted nothing poured in this house." Lady Ashbury's fork clattered against her plate. The colour drained from her face. For a moment she seemed about to speak, then with visible effort resumed her composure. Poirot's eyes gleamed. He said nothing, but Hastings, who knew him too well, caught the tiny lift of his brow. A chord had been struck. Later, in Poirot's room, Hastings burst out, "You saw her, Poirot? Lady Ashbury knows something about that brandy." "Eh bien, Hastings," Poirot murmured, settling his tie with delicate fingers. "At last you begin to observe." Yes, her reaction was not of surprise, but of recognition. And that tells me this. Sir Charles feared poison. He feared it enough to speak of it often. But he also trusted someone enough to drink in their presence. That trust, Hastings, was his undoing. Poirot turned, his eyes alight with certainty. "We draw near, mon ami. One more step, and the web will reveal its pattern. The murderer believes they are safe. But soon I shall pluck the thread, and the whole design will collapse." Chapter 8. The Fracture. The next morning dawned cold and sharp, the lawns glittering with frost. Within the manor, however, the atmosphere was more oppressive than ever. The death of Sir Charles had turned the elegant gathering into something far darker, and though the guests attempted polite conversation at breakfast, the words fell like pebbles into silence. Poirot, immaculate as ever, ate sparingly and seemed to listen to nothing while in fact hearing everything. His sharp eyes flicked from one face to another, weighing, measuring, judging. It was Colonel Whitcomb who shattered the brittle calm. Striking the table with his fist, he exclaimed, "Dash it all, Poirot, we can't go on like this. We're prisoners in this house, looked on as if each of us were a cutthroat. You must tell us, have you a suspect?" Poirot dabbed delicately at his lips with a napkin. "A suspect? Mais oui, mon colonel, I have several. The difficulty is to choose between them," the colonel growled, muttering into his moustache. Mrs. Miles gave a nervous cry. "But you can't mean all of us. Surely there is some clue that points clearly." "Ah, madame," Poirot interrupted gently. "There are many clues. It is the arrangement that matters. Like the pieces of a mosaic, they must be set in their correct place. For now, the picture is not complete." After breakfast, Poirot called Hastings to him. Together they walked the length of the long gallery, where ancestral portraits looked down with unsmiling eyes. Poirot's step was brisk, his head slightly bowed. "Hastings, mon ami, it is time we review. Let us consider. First, the diary, half destroyed, yet saved in part. Why save? Unless the hand that saved it was not the murderer's but another's who wished to preserve the truth. Second, the vial in the walking stick, unused, proof of fear, not of guilt. Third, the quarrel overheard at midnight. If it were Miles, why does he not deny it with vigour? He toys with suspicion, almost welcomes it. "Then you think he's innocent?" Hastings asked. "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that the guilty one is more subtle. They do not thrust themselves forward. They shrink, they evade, they conceal behind a veil of silence." As if summoned by his words, Miss Linton emerged from a side door, a book clasped in her hands. At sight of Poirot she faltered. "Monsieur Poirot, I wish to speak with you." Poirot bowed. "But of course, mademoiselle." "What troubles you?" Her lips trembled. I fear I must tell you the truth. I did not speak all yesterday. When I heard Sir Charles's voice that night, it was not only anger, there was fear in it. And the other voice, I thought it might be Mr. Miles. But now I know I was wrong. It was—" She stopped, her face paling. "It was whom?" Poirot's voice was very soft. She lowered her gaze. "It was Doctor." Then a hush seemed to fall even in the empty gallery. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "You are certain?" "Yes, I remembered. The cadence. It was his— Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most brave." Poirot inclined his head, and she hurried away. Hastings burst out, "Poirot, that's it!" Trent quarrelled with Sir Charles, and Trent, as a doctor, would know the means of subtle poison. Poirot's face remained thoughtful. "Perhaps. But remember, Hastings, the truth is not always in the word, but in why the word is spoken. Mademoiselle Linton may speak the truth, or she may seek to shield another. In psychology, as in chess, every move has purpose." That evening, with the lamps casting long shadows across the library, the atmosphere grew more strained. Mrs. Miles sobbed quietly in a corner. Edward Miles poured himself brandy with reckless defiance. Colonel Whitcomb prowled like a caged lion. Dr. Trent, pale and stiff, stood apart, his gaze fixed on the fire. It was Lady Ashbury who broke the silence. Rising suddenly, she cried, "This cannot continue. My husband lies in his grave, and we sit here like actors in some ghastly play. Monsieur Poirot, if you know the truth, speak it. If you suspect someone, say so." Poirot rose, his small figure commanding the room. "Madame, soon I shall. But not yet, for first I must make the little experiment, the trap, as you English call it. And when it is sprung, then, mes amis, you shall have the truth entire." His eyes swept over them, brilliant, piercing. "For now, I tell you only this. The murderer is here, among us. They believe themselves safe, but they have overlooked one thing, a single detail, small, so small, yet fatal, and because of it, the edifice of lies will crumble." The clock on the mantel struck 9. Each stroke seemed to reverberate through the tense silence, and Hastings, watching the faces in the firelight, thought he saw fear, raw, naked fear, flash in one pair of eyes before it was swiftly masked. Chapter 9. Poirot Sets the Trap. The atmosphere in Greystone Manor that evening was charged, as if the very walls anticipated revelation. A storm brooded beyond the windows, wind moaning low through the chimneys, while within, the company huddled by the fire in uneasy silence. The servants moved quietly, their eyes darting toward Poirot, who seemed to hold the entire house in his small, immaculate hands. He sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, fingertips pressed together, his eyes half closed as though in meditation. Hastings, seated close by, knew well the look. It meant the little grey cells were arranging themselves into a final pattern. At last Poirot stirred. He rose and addressed the room, his voice calm but carrying authority. "Mes amis, the hour has come. The truth is within our grasp, but it requires a final effort. Tonight we shall lay a trap for the murderer of Sir Charles Ashbury." Gasps broke from the group. Colonel Whitcomb muttered angrily, Edward Miles gave a short, harsh laugh, and Lady Ashbury clasped her hands tightly together. Poirot raised his hand for silence. "You are weary, oui. Suspicion weighs upon you all. But consider, how much more weary is the guilty one, who must wear always the mask. Tonight I shall remove it." Hastings leaned forward eagerly. "But Poirot, what do you mean to do?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Patience, Hastings. You shall see." He moved toward the desk where Sir Charles's diary now lay, rescued fragments carefully gathered in a folder. This, the diary, it is the key. Sir Charles sought to burn it, yet not all was destroyed. Why? Because another intervened, someone who wished the truth not wholly lost. That is curious, n'est-ce pas? The murderer would have burned every page, but the rescuer saved enough. That rescuer is afraid, but also remorseful. A ripple passed through the company. Mrs. Miles gave a strangled cry. "Not I swear it was not I." Poirot turned to her gently. "No, madame, not you." He fixed his gaze then on Dr. Trent. "Doctor, you quarrelled with Sir Charles the night of his death." Miss Linton has testified. Trent's face hardened. "I did speak with him. He summoned me. But it was not a quarrel, it was a consultation. He feared for his health." Poirot's moustaches twitched. "Ah, you are clever. You admit the meeting, but you change its colour. Yet Sir Charles had no heart trouble, no illness to consult upon. No, doctor, it was not medicine that passed between you. It was accusation." Trent flushed darkly but held his tongue. Poirot moved on. His eyes fell upon Edward Miles. "And you, monsieur, you profit by Sir Charles's death. Inheritance, yes? You had motive, and you were near the study. Yet you're too blatant, too careless. That is not the way of the true criminal." Edward's mouth twisted into a sneer. "So you clear me by insulting me?" How kind. Poirot ignored him. His gaze returned to Lady Ashbury. "And you, madam? You feared disgrace, debts, scandal. You begged me for discretion. You tremble when brandy is named because you know Sir Charles suspected poison. But you are proud and not foolish. You would never have chosen a method so clumsy." Lady Ashbury's lips parted, but she said nothing. Poirot drew himself up, his eyes flashing. "So, who remains? Who has lied? Not once, but many times. Who claimed to read until 1 o'clock yet trembles at every question? Who pointed the finger at another, first Edward, then the doctor? Who sits silent now, hoping to escape notice? All eyes turned. Miss Violet Linton sat, very still, her face drained of colour. Poirot's voice cut like a blade. "It was you, mademoiselle. You who destroyed the diary, yet saved a fragment. You who spied upon us in the study at night. You who feared that Sir Charles would reveal your secret. And so, you silenced him." A gasp rose. Miss Linton leapt to her feet, her eyes blazing with sudden fury. "It is a lie!" I had no reason." "Ah, but you had," Poirot interrupted softly. "Sir Charles discovered it. You were not merely a governess, were you? You were once employed in his London office. You knew of irregularities, fraud, embezzlement, money taken, and Sir Charles, he had proof. Proof he recorded in his diary. That, mademoiselle, is what you feared." Miss Linton's hands trembled violently. "No, he would have ruined me. He threatened." Her words broke into a sob. The silence that followed was more damning than any confession. Poirot raised a finger. "The trap, you see, was simple. I spoke of the rescuer of the diary. Only the guilty one would fear that I had proof, and you betrayed yourself. The others look to me. You look to the fire." The clock on the mantel struck. Each chime seemed to seal her fate. Poirot's voice, quiet now, filled the room. "Tomorrow, mes amis, I shall give you the whole story. For tonight, remember this. The murderer always reveals themselves not by weapon, nor by alibi, but by the working of the mind. And that, Hastings, never fails Poirot." Chapter 10. The Truth Revealed. The following evening the household gathered once more in the library at Poirot's request. Outside, the wind howled across the frost-bitten lawns, rattling the bare branches of the trees. Within, the great fire blazed, yet its warmth did little to dispel the chill of anticipation that gripped every guest. Poirot stood before the hearth, small, neat, composed, his hands clasped lightly behind his back. His eyes, bright and piercing, swept over them all. "Mes amis," he began, "the time has come. You shall have the truth, entire and complete. The death of Sir Charles Ashbury, it was no accident, no suicide. It was murder, and the murderer sits among us." A murmur rippled through the room. Edward Miles gave his usual scoffing laugh, but it was hollow now. Lady Ashbury's hands gripped the arm of her chair until her knuckles whitened. Colonel Whitcomb scowled, his face purple with suppressed anger. Dr. Trent's gaze was fixed and hard. Mrs. Miles whimpered softly into her handkerchief. Miss Linton sat very still, her eyes lowered, her lips pressed tightly together. Poirot lifted a finger. "First, let us consider the diary. Sir Charles, he feared exposure, not of himself but of another. He wrote, 'The truth must come out, though it may destroy us all.' He began to burn it, but it was not he who stopped the flames. It was another, someone who wished to conceal the whole, yet could not bring themselves to obliterate every page. That half-heartedness, it betrayed them. He turned, his eyes alighting on Miss Linton. She flinched but remained silent. Second, the quarrel at midnight. Miss Linton told us first that it was Edward Miles, then later that it was Dr. Trent. Both times she misdirected. Why? Because it was she herself who quarrelled with Sir Charles. She was the one in the study. Gasps rose. Hastings leaned forward, scarcely daring to breathe. Poirot continued, his tone relentless but never raised. Sir Charles had discovered her secret. Years ago in London, Mademoiselle Violet Linton was not merely a governess, but a secretary in Sir Charles's firm. There were irregularities in the accounts, money missing. She fled, reinventing herself in another role. But Sir Charles knew her face when first she arrived here. He kept his silence until he found proof he wrote in his diary. Miss Linton's lips parted, but no words came. Poirot's moustaches quivered. And so, confronted that night, she panicked. Sir Charles threatened exposure, perhaps prosecution. She had with her a sedative, obtained under false pretence from Dr. Trent's prescription for Mrs. Miles. A few drops in the brandy he finally agreed to share, and Sir Charles was silenced. It was cunning, no mark of violence, no trace at first glance, but the psychology, it betrayed her. For afterwards, she lingered. She feared the diary. She tried to burn it, then lost her nerve. That is why fragments remained. Later she crept back to watch me in the study, desperate to know what I had discovered. The fire crackled. No one moved. Poirot's gaze softened, though his voice remained grave. The walking stick with the vial, it was nothing. Sir Charles carried it as a precaution. He suspected poison, and in this he was right. But it was not his vial that killed him. It was hers. She used his fear to mask her act. At last Miss Linton rose to her feet, her composure shattering. "Yes," she cried. "Yes, it was I." He would have ruined me, dragged my name through the mire. What choice had I? Poirot regarded her steadily. "There is always choice, mademoiselle. But you chose death for another rather than disgrace for yourself." Lady Ashbury covered her face with her hands. Colonel Whitcomb muttered, "By heaven, I'd never have believed it." Mrs. Miles sobbed aloud. Edward Miles looked half aghast, half triumphant that suspicion had at last turned from him. Dr. Trent folded his arms, grim and silent. Poirot lifted his hand for quiet. "Justice, it will take its course. My task, it is finished. The puzzle, it is solved." He turned to Hastings, his expression softening. "You see, mon ami? Always it is the little thing. The hesitation, the change of story, the tremor of the hand, the psychology, it tells more than the evidence. And so, once again, we have the truth." The fire flared, sending sparks up the chimney as though marking the end of a long and terrible play. And in the silence that followed, Hercule Poirot stood, proud and grave, the master of the riddle that had haunted Greystone Manor. Chapter 11. Reflections at Greystone the day after the confession dawned calm, as though the storm that had raged within the house had at last exhausted itself. A pale winter sun touched the lawns of Greystone Manor, and the mist that had clung so stubbornly to its turrets lifted, revealing the estate in quiet dignity. Yet within, the echoes of the past days lingered, fear, suspicion, and the dreadful revelation of guilt. Miss Violet Linton, pale and composed now that her secret was stripped bare, was placed under discreet watch until the authorities could arrive. She spoke little after her outburst, but Hastings, who passed her in the corridor, thought her expression one not merely of defeat, but of weary relief, as though a burden too long carried had at last dropped from her shoulders. Poirot, however, was serene. He breakfasted with his customary neatness, every crumb brushed aside, his napkin folded with precision. Hastings, opposite him, could not contain his thoughts. "My dear Poirot," he burst out, "you astonish me yet again." To think it was Miss Linton all along. She seemed so quiet, so reserved, almost timid. One would hardly imagine her capable of such a crime. Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, Hastings, that is where psychology enters. The timid soul, when pressed, may act more desperately than the bold. For the bold man accepts risk as part of life. The timid one, who has lived in fear, will strike to destroy the thing that threatens them. And Sir Charles, with his diary, was precisely such a threat." "But the clues," Hastings persisted, "they were so small. Ashes in the grate, a torn page, her contradictory words. How could you be so sure?" Poirot tapped a finger to his temple. "The little grey cells, Hastings. The burnt diary was not burnt through. That told me the destroyer lacked resolve. A true criminal, certain of their act, would leave no fragment. The trembling hand belongs not to the hardened villain, but to one who fears herself as much as discovery." When Mademoiselle Linton accused first one, then another, she revealed her own guilt. For why lie, except to divert suspicion? Why tremble, except from conscience? He sipped his coffee delicately, then continued. And there was the psychology of Sir Charles himself. A man proud, stubborn, not easily intimidated. He would never have kept silence over business irregularities unless there was personal reason. And when I saw his words, "The truth must come out," I knew it was not business alone, but betrayal close to home. Only someone within his circle, someone he allowed near him, could achieve this. And that, Hastings, was Mademoiselle Linton. Hastings nodded slowly. Yes, I see it now. But still, I can hardly reconcile it with the quiet figure in the drawing-room. Poirot's eyes grew grave. Do not be deceived, mon ami. The quietest waters may run the deepest, and conceal the deadliest currents. Later that morning, Lady Ashbury sought Poirot privately. She was composed, but the strain of the past days had left its mark. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice low, I scarcely know how to thank you. You have saved my household from endless torment, and yet, the scandal. Poirot bowed. Madame, scandal will pass, but the truth, it must remain. To bury a crime, it is to allow it to fester. You will endure, because you have dignity, and because you are innocent. That, in the end, is stronger than rumour. Tears glimmered in her eyes, but she inclined her head in silent gratitude. By afternoon, arrangements were complete. Miss Linton would be conveyed away discreetly under guard. The household began to disperse, the Colonel with loud protestations of his wasted holiday, Edward Miles swaggering but clearly shaken, Mrs. Miles fluttering in a fog of tears. Dr. Trent, grave as ever, shook Poirot's hand with surprising warmth, as though acknowledging a master he had long resisted. As the carriage rolled away with Miss Linton within, Poirot and Hastings stood together at the great door. "It is curious, Poirot," Hastings said softly. "She seemed almost at peace at the end." Poirot nodded. "Oui. To confess is sometimes a relief. To live with the lie, it is the greater punishment." He drew his cloak neatly around his shoulders. "And so, Hastings, once again the little grey cells have triumphed. The guilty are revealed, the innocent protected. For Poirot, that is enough." The wind stirred through the bare trees, carrying away the last whispers of fear that had haunted Greystone Manor. Hastings looked at his friend with deep admiration, as he had so many times before. "Poirot," he said quietly, "you're the greatest detective that ever lived." Poirot's moustaches twitched with satisfaction, and his small figure straightened proudly. "Mais oui, Hastings," he replied. "It is the truth." And one must never be afraid of the truth. Chapter 12. Poirot's departure. 2 days later, Greystone Manor stood hushed once more, its windows gleaming pale in the weak winter sunlight. The drama that had convulsed its walls seemed now like a shadow already fading, though its mark would never wholly vanish. The great house bore an air of dignity regained, yet beneath it Hastings sensed the silence of shame, a family wounded by scandal, though saved from a darker fate. Poirot was the last of the guests to depart. He moved through the hall that morning with his usual brisk step, his valise packed, his hat brushed to perfection, his moustaches stiffly triumphant. Hastings, ever at his side, could not help marvelling at his friend's composure. Lady Ashbury received them in the drawing-room. She was dressed in black silk, her manner calm, though her face lined with strain. "Monsieur Poirot," she said gravely, "I can offer you only inadequate thanks. You have brought light into darkness. Without you, the truth might never have been known." Poirot bowed with exquisite formality. "Madame, it was my duty. Justice, she must be served. And though the truth is sometimes bitter, it is better than the poison of lies." Her eyes softened. "You have saved us from endless suspicion. For that, I am grateful." "Courage, madam," Poirot said gently. "This storm will pass. Greystone will endure." They took their leave. In the carriage that bore them away down the long frosted drive, Hastings turned to Poirot with the inevitable question. "My dear fellow, do you never weary of it? Always murder, always deceit, always the strain of unravelling other people's wickedness?" Poirot smiled faintly, adjusting his gloves. "No, Hastings. For to me, each crime is a riddle, and in each riddle there is order waiting to be restored. To restore order, that is my satisfaction. Where there is confusion, Poirot brings clarity. Where there is injustice, Poirot brings justice. It is my nature, mon ami. Without such puzzles, I should wither like the flower denied the sun." Hastings regarded him with affection. "And yet, you never pity them, the guilty." Poirot's gaze rested on the Winterfield sliding past. "I pity always the weakness that leads to crime, but I do not pity the crime itself. Mademoiselle Linton, she was not wicked by nature, but she was weak, and weakness, when allied with fear, may kill as surely as malice. It is a tragedy, Hastings, but one of her own making. The carriage rattled on, the road stretching white ahead. Poirot leaned back, his small figure composed, serene. "So, Hastings," he said at last, "once more we leave behind us the house of sorrow, and once more Poirot has prevailed. The little grey cells, they have not failed me yet," Hastings smiled ruefully. "Nor ever will, I fancy." Poirot's moustaches twitched with pride. He closed his eyes briefly, as though content with the world restored to balance, and thus they passed from Greystone Manor, leaving behind the echoes of deceit and death, the smouldering diary, and the shadow of Sir Charles Ashbury's fall. Ahead lay new roads, new puzzles, new tragedies waiting for the keen eye of Hercule Poirot. But for now, in the hush of that winter morning, there was only silence, order restored, and the quiet triumph of a mind that had once again seen through darkness to the light.